Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1322. I will terminate the article of Blakemore and Decety from the perception of action to the understanding of intention. I'll continue where I left off. I will then continue with the first take on Amy Cuddy. And here a little quote: "Time is the important coefficient in development." Recognizing our own intentions. Self-produced sensations can be correctly predicted on the basis of efference copy signals. This accurate prediction can be used to cancel or attenuate the ensuing sensation By contrast, externally generated sensations are not associated with efference copy signals. And therefore cannot be accurately predicted by the forward model. Forward model sensations therefore cannot be perceptually attenuated. By using such a predictive system, it is possible to cancel or attenuate sensations induced by self-generated movement, and thereby distinguish the sensory consequences of one's own intention from sensory events arising from an external source. Evidence for this mechanism comes from psychophysical studies that show that subjects experience external tactile stimulation as more intense than the same simulation when it is self-produced. The attenuation of self-produced stimulation seems to be mediated in part by the gating of neural responses to self-produced stimulation. Seems to be mediated in part by the gating of neural responses to self-produced stimulation in the brain regions that process the particular modality of stimulus. Somatosensory cortical responses to self-produced touch are attenuated relative to external touch in animals and humans. Similarly, auditory cortical responses to self-produced speech are attenuated relative to external speech. To be attenuated self-produced stimuli must be predicted. This is a point that Jan Eiskens makes many times. You need to know that you are stimulating yourself. There is evidence that the cerebellum is involved in such a predicative system. Storing representations of motor commands and their sensory consequences. Body kinematics, external cues, and action contexts. From which predictions are made. It has been proposed that together with higher cortical regions, the cerebellum monitors the correspondence between intended and achieved states. I will read a short extra paragraph here of theory of mind task. Higher level theory of mind tasks, such as those involving an understanding of other people's desires and beliefs, have consistently activated the medial frontal lobe. In functional imaging studies. In the first brain imaging study on theory of mind, subjects were scanned using positron emission tomography, PET. While they performed story comprehension tasks that required the attribution of mental states. In one such story, the subject had to work out that the protagonist's action a robber giving himself up to the police was based on his assumption about the policeman's belief. That is, that he had robbed a shop. This task required mental state attribution because the beliefs of the policeman were not made explicit in the story. These theory of mind tasks, when compared with comprehension tasks involving physical stories. That did not require mental state attribution. Produced activation in the left medial frontal gyrus. The medial frontal gyrus has also been activated in brain imaging studies in which subjects made decisions about the mental states of people depicted in cartoons and of animate shapes. The figure shows the medial prefrontal cortex activation during mental state attribution in a study involving non-verbal stimuli. In this functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, study, healthy subjects were presented with cartoons that either did or did not require mental state attribution to be understood. The medial frontal gyrus was specifically activated when subjects saw cartoons that involved mental state attribution compared with those that did not. These studies may have implications for the neural basis of autism and schizophrenia, both of which are characterized by symptoms associated with an impairment in theory. Of mind tasks. Indeed, recent studies have shown significantly less activation in the medial frontal gyrus during theory of mind tasks in people with Asperger's syndrome. A high-functioning class of autistic disorder, and in with people with schizophrenia than in control subjects. This should be compared to content, as we discussed earlier in Wittgenstein and Heidegger, and not paying attention to the form. It's a bit like the last paradigm, the Newtonian, ignoring the canvas, or if you prefer, mood, and I would say skill. In a way, this is actually based on the misunderstanding that Witherspoon takes out, and that misunderstanding that content only is sufficient. Both content and form goes hand in hand. So it's a dual system. There can be differences here in the canvas, mood, skill, form that has significant effects on the actual result, although we are constantly only talking about content. We have briefly described the evidence that motor commands can be used to predict the sensory consequences of self-generated movement, a process that involves the cerebellum. It is possible that the process used by the forward model to predict the sensory consequences of one's own movements could also be used to estimate intentions from the observation of other people's actions. The forward model stores representation of sensory predictions associated with multiple actions. These predictions are based on the motor command issued to make the actions. This store of predictions of the consequences of self-generated action could also be used to estimate the motor command and therefore the intentions that gave rise to an action made by another person. The usual direction of predication in the forward model is from self-generated interactions and motor commands to the consequences of actions. When we observe another person's actions, related mechanism could operate in the reverse direction. First, the observed sensory consequences of another person's actions would be mapped onto stored sensory predictions. That is, of the sensory consequences of one's own actions. These stored representations could then be used to estimate the motor commands and intentions that would normally precede such an action. This could be achieved by automatically and unconsciously simulating the observed action and estimate what our own intentions would be if we produced the same action within the same context. For example, when thirsty, you might reach for a glass of water with the intention of picking it up and drinking from it. The forward model stores representations of the sensory information associated with these intentions. For instance, the weight of the glass, the arm's kinematics, the grip, font required to pick up the glass, based on years of experience of picking up glasses. When the brain generates the motor commands to reach and grasp the glass, the forward model predicts the sensory consequences of the motor commands. Now, when you see someone else picking up a glass, the stored representations of the sensory predictions associated with picking up a glass may be recruited and used to estimate what your motor commands and intentions would have been if you had made that same movement. in this way, the forward model could go from the mere observation of someone reaching for a glass to the estimation that the person's intention is to pick up the glass, lift it to her mouth and quench her thirst. By simulating another person's actions, mapping them onto stored representations of our own motor commands and their consequences, which are stored in the cerebellum. Do remember Barder here, the grandmaster of the cerebellum. It might be possible to estimate the observed person's internal states, which, of course, I had to add, cannot be read directly from the movements. The simulating system could also provide information from which prediction about the person's future actions could be made. This is a new framework for an idea reminiscent of the philosophical concept that we understand people's minds by covertly, inside or secretly, simulating their behavior. There is an accumulating neurophysiological evidence to support a role for action simulation in the brain. The role of simulation and imitation several cognitive and developmental psychologists have postulated a common coding for actions performed by the self and by another person, also referred to as simulation, resonance behavior, and, I'd say most important, shared representations. In recent years, interest in these concepts has been revived by the neurophysiological discovery of mirror neurons in the monkey ventral premotor cortex. Which discharge both when the monkey performs specific goal-directed hand movements and when it observes another individual performing the same movements. There is now strong evidence that in humans several brain regions, including the premotor cortex, the posterior parietal cortex, and the cerebellum, are activated during action generation and while observing and simulating others' actions. This finding has been made using various neuroimaging techniques, including PET, transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and magnetoencephalogram, MEG. Particularly interesting is the demonstration that action observation activates the premotor cortex in a somatotopic manner. Simply watching mouth, hand, and foot movements activates the same functionally specific regions of premotor cortex as performing those movements. Let me repeat that for clearance. It's absolutely enough to watch mouth, hand and foot movements to have an aggregation in one's own premotor cortex as performing those movements. A natural link between action observation and generation is provided by motor imitation. The finding that very young babies can imitate facial gestures indicates an innate or early developing system for coupling the perception and production of human actions. Research on neonatal imitation has emphasized its role in non-verbal communication and indicates that it provides a link between actions and mental states. In an interesting series of experiments, 18 old months baby were exposed either to a human or to a mechanical device attempting to perform various actions. But failing to achieve them. The children tended to imitate and complete the action when it was made by the human. But not when it was made by the mechanical device. This shows that pre-verbal infants' understanding of people, but not inanimate objects, is within a framework that includes goals and intentions, which can be gleaned from surface behavior alone. Meltzow et al. Have proposed that imitation might serve as an automatic way of interpreting the behaviors of others in terms of their underlying intentions and desires. This could be achieved if, during imitation, the stored representations of one's own intentions and the same action contexts were recruited and used to estimate the imitated person's intentions. Several functional imaging studies have attempted to explore the neural correlates of imitation in the human brain. In one study, subjects were scanned while they watched actions for later imitation. This resulted in activation in the same parietal and premotor regions that are involved in producing actions. Indicating that during observation of action, the neural networks subserving motor representations are already tuned for imitation. Importantly, observing actions for later imitation also activated the cerebellum. This would be expected during action simulation. The brain recruited the stored representations of one's own intentions and the same action contexts, which are proposed to be stored in the cerebellum. Two recent studies investigated the neural correlates of online imitation. The first conducted by Ragone et al. Using functional magnetic resonance imaging showed increased activation of the parietal lobe. Broca's area and the somatosensory cortex during finger movement copying compared with observing finger movements. The second study used PET scanners to explore hemodynamic responses to reciprocal imitation. Between the observer and experimented, and found that the right inferior parietal lobe STS bilaterally medial prefrontal cortex and cerebellum were specifically activated during imitation compared with matched non-imitative action. The activation of these regions, in particular the STS and the medial prefrontal cortex during imitation, lends neurophysiological support to the proposal that motor imitation provides an avenue for developing a theory of mind. A theory based on evidence of early imitation in infants. So I will read their conclusion, which is short, and take a pause and draw out on the whiteboard what this is about. As I understand it, of course. Conclusion. The psychophysical and neurophysiological studies that we have reviewed support the idea that the brain is a powerful simulating machine designed to detect biological motion in order to extract intentions from the motion and to predict the future actions of other animate beings. In the future, it would be interesting if design experiments that directly evaluate unanswered questions regarding the relationship between one's own intentions and those of others. For example, to what extent and at what level is there a real overlap between representations of our own intentions and the intentions of others? How does the brain distinguish between the representations? What is the nature of the mechanisms by which the observation of action allows us to read intentions? That is, how can the respective contribution of bottom-up and top-down processes in the attribution of intentions to biological motion be disentangled? So that was the conclusion, and I will now put in a short pause. Pause. So there are two aspects. So I mentioned mid in the reading about the content form system, and this is showing that those things cannot be separated. The form and the content goes together. There is also a temporal aspect here, and that is the old model with past and a thin line that is the now, and beyond that, usually in the Western culture in front of you, is the future. It does not work this way, according to Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and now also from the science of cognition. Actually representational in the idea of a sort of engravement or writing in the head and storage doesn't even make sense. And this has earlier been questioned from an evolutionary perspective, but now you can see a more sensible model for how it works. That the brain is not an engraving machine like a computer, if I be allowed to. This is engraving the pressing of the keys and store what has been pressed. That seems not to be the case when it comes to the human mind, because it needs to make motor cortex simulations of the things to be understood. And that goes for everything. There is no little corner of this where representation can sneak in. And I have to add, once this is understood, what representational should be or would be doesn't even make any sense anymore. We need the predictive power as shown with experiments already with neonatals for understanding of intention and for our own action. So we need to simulate not only our doings, but also the doings of others. And it's a scale which is very similar to the developmental scale in infants going to adolescence. So you develop these skills, and not a single person is alike, in contrast to the blank slate idea that everything is imprimed and get stored in the memory bank. And this is exactly the point of Wittgenstein and Heidegger. This is the point they're making, and now it is also turning up from the science of cognition. Yes, we can take some questions now.
Yes. So let me return to this that you showed earlier, this to the left, and it is very, it's actually very good, of course. I think you mean not canvas, but the frames. They are, let's say, the frames of our paintings, let's say. Not well, canvas is the content. Canvas is the content.
No, canvas is actually in the landscape problem, is where you sort of put the engravings on the piece of paper where the letters are, so to speak, depicted. But of course,
okay, yes, you can. I understand. We both have, so you also see that.
It's okay with frame as well, of course. Yes.
But I think on the left side you have the skill. You have written skill. But I think in this paper by Blakemore, Sarah Jane, she doesn't speak so much about skill, but she speaks about intention, of course.
No, skill is from Heidegger. He called it Verhir, and how to develop this, and that not all are equal. Whereas in the representational system, skill, form, mood doesn't come into the picture. Mm-hmm. And it's such an important feature, and this is now coming not only from Lee Smolin with the landscape problem. Earlier we were talking about Julian Barber and the idea of time as uninteresting as a frame, or he was speaking of a washing line that was never mentioned or didn't have a purpose, but it does have effect. And now also from Heidegger, Wittgenstein, now we say Derrida. Thank you for mentioning it with the canvas. One of the things that Derrida says is this, in between C and O, really uninteresting. Is everything that is around here just empty, non-semantic space? And of course, in his deconstruction, it shows there is a problem of thinking here, because if you take the space away, you will not have letters either. And most usually, we see the empty space as horror vacui, or I would say more reasonable, uninteresting, not to the point.
The last one would be the keyword in this article by Blakemore. It was intention, and it's in dichotomy to content, as you showed.
Yes.
We shouldn't see content, so to say, the content of the brain as something that is only there. So
No.
you need the intention, of course.
It goes hand in hand, and it's quite a revolutionary idea of the mind. I'm a bit shocked myself. She's really, the both of them are taking it a step further, and it lands exactly where Heidegger and Wittgenstein are, exactly. And of course, for me to understand the intentions of another person, I need to simulate. There is no other way. I cannot directly, as like in the representational model, read off, for instance, what is Kalle's next move. What will he be doing? And it is incredibly important, because if I don't know your intentions, I cannot understand you. And I took up that earlier when we have an article about autism, and that autistic people cannot understand grasping of a glass. So if my hand is going toward the glass, they don't understand it until I grasp it. And then it is too late. So that's a fundamental dual system, as it could be called, if you see it from the viewpoint of the old idea. But actually it's not dual. But we will initially perceive it as being dual. And I think it's very good to have sound scientific evidence for Heidegger and Wittgenstein. And also it is not only, sorry to say that, abstract thinking, it's something very deep down. And I will now go on to Amy Cuddy and see how we can transform that into something that can further the skill. Skill needs to be further developed, because that is learning. This is a little article from Imogen Ragone, and it's about putting Amy Cuddy, the famed presenter of TEDx, I think that's what she's most famed for, and the real startup of the idea of how we present ourselves, how our posture is, what we do with our hands, fingers, legs, bodies, has a direct effect on how we feel and how we are able to perceive, because it's all due to the prediction. And we know that having different posture will make understanding less possible. So the thinking, action, body skill are very important. I will take some more.
No, but the name of the article right
Okay.
on the I think is very useful for everybody.
Yes. Imogen Ragone, and I will start to read here. It's an article called Power, Presence, Confidence, and Vulnerability. What does these things have in common? I was thinking about this as I prepared for a workshop I presented in August 2013. The workshop was a collaboration between myself and my good friend, psychotherapist Miriam Grandeur, in which we explored the body-mind connection through the lenses of both Alexander technique and Gestalt psychotherapy. I found myself once more drawn to the work of social psychologist Amy Cuddy and the high power poses which, when done for just 2 minutes, were shown to raise your testosterone, which is the dominance hormone, and lower your cortisol, which is the stress hormone. In interactions after doing the high power poses, participants were perceived as having more presence and were described as confident, passionate, authentic, and comfortable. And that's not all. It not only changed the way they were perceived by others, but also how they felt themselves. Cuddy stated that there is already a body of evidence that our minds, how and what we think, our emotions, change our bodies. Her studies, however, clearly showed that our bodies also change our minds. As a practitioner and teacher of the Alexander technique, this is not news to me, although I am very pleased to see that we are now getting clear evidence of this. In fact, in the Alexander technique, we do not even speak so much of the mind-body connection, rather of mind-body unity. The two really cannot be separated. The high power poses, it strikes me that these open expansive postures actually display incredible vulnerability. Exposure of the neck, the throat, and the belly, for instance. By comparison, the lower power poses in which we contract and close ourselves in. Can be thought of as a way to protect or armor ourselves. It is ironic, perhaps, that we experience power, confidence, and presence by allowing ourselves to be more vulnerable. In Alexander technique lessons and classes, students are invited to let go of unnecessary tension, contraction. For me, this was a wonderfully novel experience, but one that in the beginning also brought on feelings of vulnerability and exposure. I persisted despite these feelings, as I was experiencing a great relief in my neck tension and back that I'd carried around for years. And the more I was able to open up, the more confident I felt, and the more able to be my true self. From what I can glean from Caddy's study, it does not matter how you do the high power poses to get a positive effect. I am interested in exploring how adding some Alexander technique, thinking, and awareness to how the poses are executed might enhance them further. My guess is that the two together will be even more effective. In the meantime, next time you have an important or stressful event coming up, try doing 2 minutes of high power poses beforehand. You will likely go into a more confidently and with greater presence in a way that feels comfortable and true to yourself. Using the Alexander technique to lower stress hormones. How do Alexander technique, mind-body practices help us stay expanded? In activity, enabling us to utilize Harvard professor Amy Cuddy's research. And power pose practices that can help lower cortisol levels and raise testosterone. Evidence-based power poses research by Amy Cuddy and colleagues indicates contracted or tense poses and posture raise cortisol stress hormone levels in our body and lower our testosterone. Higher cortisol levels can increase stress reactivity, affect mood and performance, reduce confidence and risk tolerance, and have other negative health effects. Expanded or more relaxed poses and posture raises testosterone and lower cortisol in your body. Higher testosterone levels can help us handle stress better. feel more confident and powerful and improve performance. Evidence-based Alexander technique. Mind-body practices help us learn how to expand in activity by releasing contracted, habitually tensed muscles and movement patterns. In addition to letting go of unnecessary muscle tension, the AT teaches us how to improve posture and breathing, and how to move and use our body with more ease and mindful awareness in all our activities. Imogen Ragone has here added a Charlie Brown comics, Peanuts, where Charlie Brown show his depressed stance. And he concludes the comic strip, if you're going to get any joy out of being depressed, you get to stand like this. There's so much wisdom in this cartoon, but when I first saw it, I was a little offended. It's a serious illness, I thought to myself. Depression is not caused by poor posture. I was right, of course, but Charlie Brown was also right. The truth is that bad posture does not cause depression, but it does not help the condition. And vice versa, fixing your posture will not cure your depression, but it sure does help. Maybe you battle depression, or maybe not. Either way, it's important to pay attention to your posture. Jordan Peterson, a controversial best-selling author, says that you should stand up straight with your shoulders back. That's rule number 1 in his book, 12 Rules for Life. That's a good rule, whatever you think of him. Peterson argues that body language is ancient. Hundreds of millions of years ancient. Even lobsters display mood and hierarchy via body language. For humans, standing up straight with your shoulders back tells your fellow humans that you are a high status individual in your tribe. Maybe you don't even believe in hierarchies, but there is a problem. Our brains have remained unchanged for 50,000 years. This means that your biochemistry still believes in status. Standing up straight does not just send signals to your fellow humans. It sends a signal to your cells. In the book Presence, bringing your boldest self to your biggest challenges of Amy Cuddy backs this up with tons of research. The science is overwhelmingly clear. Your body language, including your facial expressions, affects your hormones, your mood, your health. And here was a pro tip by Imogen. Whether you're sitting or standing, roll your shoulders forward up and then back in one smooth movement. This resets the shoulders to a position that you cannot otherwise get them into, and helps to create a better posture the victory pose. Kadi talks about a power posture called the victory pose that seems to be universal across all cultures. Two fists held to the sky in V shape, chest open, excitement on the face. This is apparent even in people that are congenitally blind. Try it. Pretend you just won the NYC marathon. Hold the posture for 30 seconds and your biochemistry will change. Posture affects your ki. The Qigong masters have been saying something similar for millennia, albeit in slightly different terms. They did not talk about biochemistry, but rather about qi, or your vital energy. The Qigong masters taught us that specific postures affect your qi in specific ways. For example, ancient texts on the 8 brocades Qigong talk about the effects each posture has on various organs. From those texts, we know that 1. Supporting the heavens stimulates the triple warmer meridian. 2. Drawing a bow stimulates the kidney and spleen meridians. Raising one hand stimulates the spleen and stomach meridians. Looking backward eliminates the 5 fatigues and 7 illnesses. 5. Swing the head. Eliminates heart fire. 6. Punching with fiery eyes builds internal strength. 7. Hold the feet strengthens the kidney meridian and lower back. Shaking the back helps to boost the immune system. On a side note, the above hypothesis can be easily verified using the diagnostic methods of Chinese medicine. For example, if a student with stomach fire practices raising one hand, we should see a change in the tongue and pulse diagnostic. And do not forget the Tai Chi masters. I could argue that all of the 10 principles of Tai Chi Chuan are an attempt to affect the Qi through proper posture. 1. Head upright, spirit rising. 2. Sink the chest, lengthen the back. 3. Loosen the waist. 4. Differentiate between empty and solid. 5. Shoulders, drop at elbows. Use will, not strength. 7. Coordinate top and bottom. 8. Harmonize internal and external. 9. Move with continuity. 10. Seek stillness in movement. But inside the slow motion postures, is a hidden power. The power to save your life in self-defense. For example, the Lu posture from Yang Tai Chi can be used to break the neck of someone attacking you. It looks harmless, but once you understand the martial application of the technique, you quickly realize that it is powerful. Sadly, the vast majority of Tai Chi practitioners have no clue about the martial applications. They learn it as a form of Qigong. Not as a martial art. Even a cursory understanding of the martial applications helps to bring the postures to life. You do not need to be a cage fighter to benefit from the hidden power of the Tai Chi postures. On the other hand, many people obviously benefit from practicing Tai Chi, and I think that the continued practice can alleviate a whole spectrum of physical and or mind ailments. A good example of the different reflexes we have as human beings, and where the expand reflex and up direction are one of them. Is called the Moro reflex. Something that is present in young infants. It aids the baby's survival and development in its first few months. After the Moro reflex has reached maturity and been inhibited by the development of higher brain centers, it should no longer be possible to elicit the Moro reflex in normal circumstances. This is an accepted medical fact. What doctors generally do not recognize is in how many of us the moral reflex fails to come to full maturity. Instead, it remains partially aberrant, immature, uninhibited, causing undue reactions to any stimulus that we unconsciously perceive to be unexpected or threatening. An immature moral reflex will impair the functioning of not only the vestibular system, which is responsible for balance in the gravitational field, but also the autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for emotional balance. One of the developmental functions of the moral reflex is to oppose an even more primitive fear reaction known as the fear paralysis response, the FPR. In the animal world, the FPR may be observed in the frog that plays dead, or the rabbit caught in a car's headlight. In normal circumstances, the FPR should not be seen in human beings outside the womb. Although in people who have an immature moral reflex, a remnant of the FPR will often be observable. In response to perceived danger, they will sometimes turn red as the moral takes over, and then turn white as the FPR comes through. Again, it may be that free divers who are able to remain under water for extraordinary lengths of time are in some way accessing the FPR. The FPR is associated with extreme dominance of the parasympathetic nervous system, with pallor, loss of muscle tone, and slowing of heartbeat and respiration to conserve energy. The Moro, in contrast, is associated with extreme dominance of the sympathetic nervous system, with reddening of the skin, heightened muscle tone, and faster heartbeat and respiration in preparation for rapid expenditure of energy for fight or flight. Before it gets too theoretical, maybe I can show a few of the things on my colleague Kalle Lundahl, with his permission. Would that be okay?
Yes.
If you pull out a chair there, it would be easier to show some of the things that Kalle/Imogen are pointing to. And one thing are the different regular movements. We have, for instance, the power posture of this one, and you can also do this one, recommended in some instances, lifting the sky. And we have this one, which is connected to Superman and people of power. They will change the testosterone levels to a benign level and also lower the cortisol. Even more interesting, we have different repetitive movements that goes to shield us from the exterior, and when we contract, we shield ourselves from the outside. So there is a purpose to this shielding. I will show a few photos.